Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology. I got a great guest today. My old friend Mann is going to join me in a few seconds here. He's an astrologer, an author, an artist, an architect, and in my opinion, one of the greatest astrologers in the world, who's long been, his work has been heralded as very revolutionary and sort of cutting edge with regard to his approach to astrology. And we're going to be talking today about the presence of Pluto. Pluto is a very prominent planet in all of our charts, and yet we don't quite understand it completely, perhaps, because it's very deep and has some deep karmic threads to it. And Todd's website is atmann, that's man with two N's, atmann.net. He's a great astrologer and got a great deal of books out there that are valuable for you to look into, especially if you're learning astrology. So welcome to the show, Tad. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks, Chris.
So we were talking the other day about the presence of Pluto, and I had this discussion myself. I said, you know, I had good events happen to me when I had a Pluto transit, and I've had bad events happen to me, both of them that were monumental nonetheless. And they sort of, when you look at the presence of Pluto in your chart, it's ominous, and it has this certain sort of karmic, imprint that's attached to it. And I'm just wondering, do you think that there is a difference with a Pluto trine versus a Pluto square? Are they just going to be monumental no matter how you look at it?
Well, my feeling is that the tough aspects to Pluto, like an opposition or a conjunction or a square, I think is in a way more likely to be a kind of external manifestation than an internal one. Although one of the principles about Pluto that I've discovered over the years is the following: that Pluto is essentially telling you that whatever planet it's triggering, it's time for its influences and its patterns to die. So that they can be replaced by more, so they can be replaced by a different set of patterns that are more appropriate for the time. So the issue is that if you work with Pluto and allow a certain aspect of your life to change dramatically, then Pluto works for you in a positive way, regardless of what the aspect is. I think the difficulty arises when people kind of stonewall it. And when you resist Pluto's influences, it's so powerful that it forces that particular part of you to die.
Right. So you can't really mess with it. You've got to kind of go with the flow. And the more you resist, probably the greater the damage would be.
Right. Exactly. If you try to hang on to the vestige of what you should be removing, it's like with relationships, for example, because it can indicate the end of relationships. And so if you end a relationship and you don't completely tie up the loose ends, then that influence will lap over into the next relationship and bring with it a great sense of difficulty. I
see. Yeah. So you sort of have to pay homage to it. You can't really ignore it. There's no question you can ignore it. It's just too powerful. And if you do, it'll bring you down essentially.
Well, yeah, and I think it's actually very similar to Saturn in that respect, that Saturn's saying it's time for you to focus, and if you refuse to focus, it forces you to by eliminating certain possibilities. So, and I think that's partially why both Saturn and Pluto have quite negative impressions, not only to people in general, but to a lot of astrologers in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true.
Just because it has a very it has a very forceful influence if you don't really regard it appropriately and work with it.
Right. And if you take it in regard to, as you mentioned, as something that's sort of helping you get to your greater purpose or helping you down your pathway further, And rather than resisting it, you will actually, as you say, it'll work for you in ways that are positive. So this is going to be interesting because we're coming up into a time in the year 2020 when we're going to see Saturn and Pluto both together in the late degrees of Capricorn, which is going to be sort of the we're going to have to really, step up our game there and pay homage to it.
Absolutely. And I think, something I've been hearing recently about the political situation and so on, because as you know, I do a new and full moon newsletter that's free. Anyone out there who wants to sign up for it needs to just email me. But the gist of it is that we're in a very Neptunian time right now, although Pluto, of course, is very active, especially because Saturn is there as well. Mm-hmm. So I think Saturn coming up to Pluto is going to be an influence that's really quite powerful. In some ways, I'm beginning to really realize that this person who runs our country, who's completely out of control in all kinds of ways, is not really a cause, but he's basically a symptom.
A symptom, yes, I think that's true. Yeah,
much deeper and more collective malaise. And part of it has a lot to do, and I wrote about this in my last email newsletter. Part of it, I really believe, has to do with education and the fact that, one of the Republican Party in this country has really pushed education to a place where, like during the George Bush years and so on, where education's become so expensive that not many people can afford it.
Exactly.
I just saw a statistic in the New York Times book review yesterday on Sunday that basically said that 15-year-olds were given a test around the whole world in all of the major countries. And out of the 35 countries that participated, the 15-year-olds in America came in 33rd.
Wow, that is startling.
Which basically is saying that the educational system in this country simply doesn't work. And particularly, this is high school age. This is not college.
That is startling. Wow.
You're basically talking about the public education system falling down. And I really believe that that's a much more important factor than we imagine.
Oh, I think it is too, because without the education, we don't have we're not building for the future. We're sort of letting the future disappear.
That's right. And that's part of the reason why the technology's going away to other countries like India and so on. But also look at the U.S. chart, the Sibley chart with Pluto opposite Mercury.
Right.
That's exactly what that foretells, meaning that the educational gap is going to start really having a huge influence in the welfare of the whole country, especially as everything becomes more technological. They're having to hire people from Europe and from Asia. And, the best educated kids in the U.S. are often Asian Americans.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Like on the West Coast, I was in San Francisco 3 weeks ago or a month ago in Sacramento. And it's like you'd think of it almost as an Asian city. And there are a lot of really smart people there. And that I think that in a way we're selling ourselves out. And of course, that's also very Plutonic.
Yeah, certainly is. And taking our eye off the ball of the future in many ways is a very long term. It has tentacles that reach way into the future because we just can't reel them back. It takes a long time to recover from that. It has to start at a very young age and then work all the way through. And if we've just ignored it.
Of course. Yeah, you're losing 20 years.
Exactly.
Which is, in fact, going back to the Bush administration and all of that. The Reagan and Bush administrations, I think, were really catastrophic in all kinds of ways, just simply because the whole idea of sequestering education among people that have the money to pay for it is a very dangerous path to take.
Well, it leaves it for the elite and doesn't make an equitable situation for those of us. And at one time, when you and I were growing up, college was essentially state colleges in many states was free, or at least reduced tuition was highly affordable. Now it's out of control. Yeah,
when I went to Cornell Architecture School for 5 years in the 60s, I lived in New York State, which was a great help. But the College of Architecture was not a state school. But the idea was that I paid as much for 5 years then in the 1960s, you would pay, which was around $25,000 for 5 years.
Wow, that's amazing.
Now it's closer to 30 or 35 for 1 year.
If not higher. For Cornell, it's probably 50, at least.
If not higher. So it's like kids. I can't imagine how you have kids. I have a daughter. I actually moved to England 40 years ago, 45 years ago, because I knew that my daughter wouldn't get a good education in the U.S. And so she ended up going to fantastic schools, including, Central St. Martin's, probably the best art school in London, in the same class as Stella McCartney, and then, the Royal College of Art. And it was essentially free.
Wow, that's incredible. So this is a real harbinger of the decline of U.S. civilization in many ways. I mean, not paying homage to our education is a sure death knell for us.
Right. Well, Pluto's already passed its opposition to the Sibley Sun in Cancer.
Right.
And Saturn's coming up to the opposition to it. So it's like we have a president now who's essentially uneducated. Yeah. He doesn't read.
He doesn't read.
He watches television.
And bad television at that.
Everything he knows on Fox News. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, very narrow mind, very narrow scope, very limited range of adeptness in any of the major topics that we need to have help in. And yet we came from an era where life was much different. This is but the presence of Pluto in the personal chart of an individual, as you mentioned, it does set up the stage for sort of saying, here's where your corrective steps are. This is sort of the path you must take. This is an inevitability in some ways. And if you don't pay homage to that, if you reject that and say, I'm going to try everything I can to save my house or save my marriage or save my job, it's inevitable that it's not going to happen. You will pay the price ultimately.
Well, yeah, in one way or another, that will basically be the case. And for me, it's particularly interesting because, as you know, I have a totally different system of natal astrology that I call lifetime astrology. And in lifetime astrology, where Pluto is in your life process, meaning it could be in gestation, in which case just your coming into the world was a major change in your parents' relationship. Mm-hmm. I've had cases where people with Pluto on the midheaven in the chart, the conception point's the ninth cusp. The midheaven is when your mother realizes she's pregnant. And when you have Pluto on the midheaven or opposite it, it means that when your mother realized she was pregnant with you, it completely changed things. And this would be the case in some instances like two people that weren't married to each other.
Oh, yeah, of course, right.
Or where a couple of cases I had recently where parents had already had 2 or 3 kids, and like 10 years later, the wife got pregnant again
and delivers twins.
meaning that it is in some ways it is like a life and death situation, or it can be the case that there's an attempted abortion or things like that. So the whole idea of Pluto happening way back in your life has to do with your basic essence of being.
Hmm. And so do you think that there's a karmic link to it? Do you think it comes through in that regard? Does that make sense to you? With
extremely so. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the great examples was, it's interesting, when I moved to England in the early 70s, I was just learning astrology, and by the late 70s, I produced this book called The Round Art, and it was interesting because I was learning more and more and more about my techniques. And around that time, Churchill was born in I think it was 1877 or something like that, or 1875. I can't remember exactly which year it was. But the gist of it was that the 100th anniversary of his birth happened. And so I began exploring Churchill's horoscope. And Churchill's horoscope has Pluto on the ninth cusp.
Interesting.
And it's very, very, it was intriguing because basically when Churchill was born, because he was born as a member of the royal family, basically, his father, Lord Randolph, was very high up and was related to the king. Because of this, well, it was interesting because Churchill's birth weight was never announced, but he was considered to be a 7-month baby. Oh. And I discovered primarily because he and his mother actually married 7 months before Churchill was born. So I found out around in the 1970s when I was researching this that they finally published Churchill's birth weight, which was 10.5 pounds.
Wow! At 7 months. But it
wasn't 7 months.
It wasn't 7 months, exactly right. He was a full-term baby, and his mother got married after she learned she was pregnant.
Right. So I called my first lecture in the UK at Westminster Hall, opposite Westminster Abbey. The title of my talk, which got raves, was, of course, Was Winston Churchill Illegitimate?
And we don't know if even if his father was his true father, it could have been somebody else, correct?
Well, yeah, it was almost certainly Lord Randolph. But the whole idea of it vis-a-vis karma is that because Pluto happened just before he was conceived, it was thought that not that it was necessarily a rape, but that it was an aggressive conception point. Pluto on the conception point, the ninth cusp, means there was some kind of forcible connection which happened there. Mm-hmm. And it's a very fated conception. But also, what's funny is if you follow the dating in my system all the way around again, back to the ninth cusp, it happened when Churchill was appointed prime minister at the beginning of the Second World War. So he was seen as the savior of the country, which is Pluto.
Right, absolutely.
So you could say that his conception was fated, but also the thing that he did as prime minister was fated.
So he was destined to be the prime minister.
He was destined to be the prime minister during the World War that could have wiped England out.
Right, right. Really.
So, I mean, that's about as fated as you can get, I would have thought. You know?
Oh, I think so, too, especially with somebody as high profile as he, and to be in a position of such where he wielded so much power and basically held the course of England in his hands and his decisions. I mean, he got England through the World War II.
Yeah, and my reading of the chart was that when Jenny Jerome, who was late, Churchill's mother, was an American heiress, and she was visiting England with her mother. And when she discovered she was pregnant, she told her mother, who went directly to the king.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
That was about 7 weeks after conception. And so she basically said, "Your son's marrying, or your nephew is marrying my daughter."
Like it or not. Yeah, exactly.
It happened in a week later. And he, Lord Randolph was actually syphilitic, which makes it even more complicated.
Oh my gosh!
He had lots of affairs and relationships and so on. But the whole idea of it was the chart was an absolutely correct chart. It just that it basically you could pinpoint when the midheaven registers, which was around the time they got married.
Wow, that's fascinating discovery. That's something that must have been just flipped you out when you figured that out, because that's just incredible. Just incredible.
I couldn't believe it. And also, if you remember back in those days, I didn't really know many other astrologers. And so to give my first talk in England it was a huge audience because it was a local organization. The Astrological Association gave this talk. But the idea was that what a way to kind of present a system. And I thought, I need to have something that's really relevant to these people.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It was.
And it was perfect because it dealt with their famous prime minister. It's just an incredible thing.
That's right. I mean, that's about as fated as it gets.
Mm-hmm. Have you tried that same experiment with other famous people of that sort? Have you been able to see? Yeah,
of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
of course. Yeah. It's like in the same way that the great German poet and diplomat Goethe, had a kind of Saturn right on his ascendant and Pluto making an aspect to it. And he almost died. He had the cord wrapped around his neck and he was a blue baby. But again, what it signified, because in my way of looking at it, Pluto is not only death and rebirth, but it also actually is the public. And so with Pluto coming near, the transiting Pluto coming near Pluto in this chart, it's really about the public rebelling against the way the whole system works.
That would be the tearing down and then rebuilding.
In a way, so I'm beginning to think in a way that maybe Trump is the necessary vehicle that's going to enable this. People are going to get so angry at it and so irritated.
Right.
That I think something radical, which could be something violent.
Mm-hmm. It's a catalyst. He's the catalyst.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. Right. He's not a cause because he's not smart enough.
Right.
But he does echo, actually, he echoes all of those, almost 50% of the American population that voted. And that's a small percentage of the people that could vote. But this percentage of the American populace, loves him basically because they're rebelling against the system they've been in. Although Trump is the last person to try to help them do anything about it.
Right, exactly, because he doesn't have the wherewithal or the education to form policies that make sense, that bring the country forward.
And he's not interested.
He's not interested. He only wants money and deals for himself. But he's a reflection of where we are as a country, and this, I think, is a direct byproduct of this lack of education in some ways.
That's exactly that's the point I'm making, Chris, which is that that what it's alerting us to, is the fact that, and Pluto is coming closer and closer to being conjunct the American Pluto chart.
Right.
So the idea is that it really is a warning to us in a way that what is coming is something that could be really a death and rebirth in a way. And I'm not saying of an individual, but I'm saying of the whole country in a certain way.
Oh, I think
it really it has to be such a radically different strategy. In fact, I'm predicting because of the the sun in the U.S. chart for one thing, but I have a very funny feeling that the next person who's going to come after Trump and who will remedy all of the ills that he's created is going to be a woman.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, but I'm not sure it's going to happen as quickly as 2020, though. I would love to see that happen, but I don't think it's going to happen. This is a sort of a fait accompli for us because we have come this far. Our hubris has gotten as far, spread our influence far and wide, and we need to have a sort of come to Jesus awakening, for lack of a better term. And this seems to be what he has been the catalyst for. He's the deliverer of this message in some odd way.
Right. And, and in the same way, I also, because I did write a book called Astrology and the Art of Healing about medical astrology. Well, in that context, Pluto is also very interesting because it represents your immune system. And I think that's a reason why a lot of clients of mine are complaining these days, about government things, but they're really complaining because they feel so weird.
Yeah.
They feel like their health is getting out of control.
Well, we all feel a certain sense of despair because we've gone in such radical departure in ways. We're seeing outlandish comments coming out of this White House, outlandish events and edicts and all kinds of things that we're so unused to. It's almost that it's blindsided us in many ways because it's happened so. And it's almost as if it's not as if that he's just doing things because there's no rule that says he can't do it many times. It's just that he says, well, it's never been done before. So he just does it. And there's no rule on the books that says this can't be done. So he just does it. And there you go. And so he's right in some ways because he can say there's no rule about having to turn in your income tax, for example. There's no rule that has to say this. But yet, that's what he gets away with because he can say there's no law. So that's going to force the whole Constitution in many ways to perhaps be rewritten or at least reconsidered.
Well, another point, and I think I may have mentioned this to you on the amazing train ride we took together recently, but because Chris and I took the train to this amazing conference in Chicago.
Oh, gosh, what a trip!
Around 25 other astrologers, but needless to say, but anyway, before the election, I wrote a little article about Uranus in respect to the U.S. that before the November 2016 election, an exact Uranus cycle before of 84 years took us back to 1932, when there was an election in Germany. The German Federal Workers' Party actually won this election in a disputed way because there were irregularities in the votes, and also because the head of that party, Adolf Hitler, had sicked a lot of his military people on basically people in the public, particularly Jews, and basically tried to eliminate them from voting. So the whole idea was that the scary thing was that this was exactly 84 years before November of 2016 when Trump was elected. But within 2 years, Hitler basically, 2 years after he was elected, the Reichstag was mysteriously burnt to the ground, and that was the German parliament. Yeah. So basically what happened in those years was that they basically eliminated every form of government in Germany. And that's exactly what the government now is doing.
It's the same thing. It's very scary.
They're destroying the parliament and its power.
It's cyclical. At that same time, in the United States, of the era that you mentioned, referring to the Uranus opposition, Herbert Hoover was the president, and he was a strong isolationist, anti-immigrant president. So we see that same thing echoing again.
Well, but also look at the way the Germans treated the Jews and all other foreigners, by the way.
In camps, right. I know.
Yeah, it was an exact pattern that happened all over Europe and in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very pervasive thing and something that the more people know about in a way, the greater the likelihood that they'll resist it. But, it's like, where are the Democrats these days?
I know. Well, I think they're just gathering their storm. But that raises an interesting question. Is this unavoidable?
It's very hard to say because A, we don't know what's going to actually happen when that Pluto return comes about because Pluto was only discovered in 1930.
Right.
So we haven't really ever seen a Pluto return, at least to our knowledge. So I think there is an inevitability to it because it's happening.
It's happening, and we see in the EPA, we see in the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, almost every office, every department within the administration is going through a major overhaul, and so this is going to be. It's almost like it's being torn down in order to be rebuilt, and I'm not even sure where the action goes from there. Where do people turn?
It's very hard to say. I mean, he's essentially putting people as the head of these agencies who were their worst protagonists before.
It's just insane.
Like the head of the EPA was like a governor in a state that was notorious for having the worst, environmental protection laws.
And he had more lawsuits against the EPA than anybody else, and yet here he is now in charge of it. It's absurd.
It's just really crazy. But on the other hand, it is actually. I think it will actually prompt a very powerful backlash, and I certainly hope that it will, and I believe that it'll be very interesting to see what goes on. I mean, and I say interesting in a kind of terrified way, rather.
Of course.
I don't mean like intellectually interesting. I mean, it's a horrifying time in all kinds of ways. And yet at the same time, it actually seems to be what a lot of people want.
Well, it seems to be what they want. They may not want what it looks like, but they are setting in place the action places for this to come undone. It's got to come undone. There's no way. I mean, it probably has happened to every major empire, and we are considered to be a world dominating power, but that is shrinking away, and our decline is clearly evident, especially if we get into a tariff war and the stock market, and all these things are going to be just brought back to a major correcting point.
Well, but that's what's happening. It's like the government is actually pissed off the other members of the G7, and he's asking for Russia to be included. Right.
And making enemies of our closest allies. I mean, what is the logic behind this? It's just absurd. It's just absurd. Unless this is just karma. I mean, this is kismet. This is how it has to happen. This is the way it's supposed to be. And this may very well be our downfall. And we have to find a way to be, resilient enough to accommodate what that looks like, because it's probably going to be significantly different. I mean, if they do away with all the social services like Medicare, what do we do with an aging population without these social services?
Right, especially us.
Yeah.
But what's interesting also is that I did a book that was published in 1991 in the UK called Millennium Prophecies. And it was not only about Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce, but it was also all kinds of prophecies of various kinds, including the founder of the Mormons and whatever. But the interesting thing I was just thinking of it recently because I'm doing a series of programs at the Rubin Museum in New York this summer on Wednesdays in July and August. And the name of the series is essentially Astrology, Prophecy, and Divination. But what's curious about it is that in all kinds of strange ways, there are a lot of radical things going on at this particular time. And they're all actually very Plutonic. I'm looking right now, and transiting Pluto at 20 degrees of Capricorn is exactly square Chiron in the U.S. chart.
Yeah. And this shows a great, sense of where's the healing coming. There's a lot of divisiveness and a lot of anger, and but there is going to be there is a pendulum effect here of something good will come out of this. I think ultimately we just have to find that spot. We've got to get to that place and see what that looks like.
Well, Edgar Cayce, in this book, I mentioned that Cayce made prophecies going way into the 21st century. And one of the things he said was in the 2010s or 2020s that America would isolate itself from the rest of the world.
Wow.
And that's also exactly what's happening.
Wow. And then what did he say beyond that? What does that look like? Well,
he just said that it's very, very destructive because it makes America incredibly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Because we're going to be shortly in a situation where we don't have any allies. I almost begin to think that there's a Russian agent in charge here.
Well, I've always thought that Melania was that.
Well, I think
We're talking today with Mann, Mann, and we'll take a quick break. But before we do, I want to remind you about his website. It's atmann, atmann.net. He's an astrologer, an author, an artist, an architect, and in my opinion, one of the world's greatest astrologers. We'll take a quick break here, and we'll be right back to continue our discussion about Pluto. So hang in there. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support. Okay, welcome back to Turning the Wheel. We're talking today with Mann, Mann. His website is atmann, atmann.net. He's an astrologer, an author, an artist, and an architect, and a remarkable wealth of information about these great philosophical trends that we're seeing. And we're talking about Pluto, and we know that Pluto is a powerful planet in our individual's chart, one which we cannot ignore, and yet we see it in the chart of the United States. And because it takes so long to go through the whole zodiacal wheel, 248 years, we've never really seen, and no one has ever seen, a Pluto return, and yet we're coming up on one with the United States right now. But this also has to mean that countries older than us have had a Pluto return, and I'm wondering if you have any information about what that looked like for those countries.
Well, I mean, look at France, of course, in the same way that 1776 was our revolution. The 1780s and 1790s was the French Revolution.
Right.
So theirs is still to come, and you can see that beginning to happen already.
Mm-hmm. It's happening in a lot of major stages. But for countries that are older than the United States, that were established back, centuries ago, they must have had a Pluto return. Maybe the fall of the English Empire was coincided with the Pluto return of England. Who knows? We don't know that. I don't have that information at my fingertips, but it's possible because it does dispel destruction and then reconstruction. Now, out of reconstruction comes a very positive, opportunistic time to rebuild in new ways, which are much more constructive. That would be the optimistic view of where we come from the other end.
Right, exactly. And the idea also is that where Pluto falls in the chart shows an area that really gets triggered in these situations. It's like, the sun in America's chart, in the U.S. chart, is in the 7th house. Together with Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, those are all very creative partners.
Right, exactly.
Well, with Pluto in the 2nd house going opposite to the 9th house, it's like we're going into isolation, which is the opposite of having powerful partners.
Right. And then that begs the question, what happens when we are faced with some sort of national emergency or some sort of war process?
That's right, because in both world wars we had allies, very strong allies. You know, and at the moment, you know, Russia's not an ally and China's not an ally.
No, much, even though he'd like them to be. And now even our closest allies, such as Canada, our next door neighbor, is now, it's just incredible. They're on.
Well, Canada and Mexico. I mean, Trump, you know, calls all Mexicans criminals. I mean, it's, you know, it's like he's really boxing the country into a very peculiar place, which a lot of people like. But again, I would bet that most of those people, as in the same way that in England, when I lived there in the 70s and 80s, that they estimated at one point that the number of Brits who actually traveled to the continent was something very limited, like 15% of the population. And in America, you know, probably it's only 15% of the population who've ever been in countries outside of the U.S.
Only, you know, 15%.
Yeah, very low. If you think about it, people in the red states, you know, are not great travelers. You know, maybe if they travel once in their lifetime outside of America. But I just think that this revolution is, you know, America. I mean, it is a Cancer sun in the U.S. chart, meaning that we're very home-based, you know, and very provincial in all kinds of ways, and very conservative. And it's as though those particular dynamics are really being triggered.
Torn down, essentially torn down, and that makes you say, what fills that void?
Exactly. So it's really a radical change that I think is going to have a huge and profound effect upon the whole country for quite a while. When exactly does Pluto go opposite or conjunct itself?
Oh, I don't. I think it's got to be another 5 to 6 years. I think it's probably 2024, something like that.
Yeah, I think so too.
If you run it forward, you can see that it goes up to that far. It's got to be. I mean, that's going to be the true test for sure. I think it comes around. It's actually in 2022. So that would be after the next election. So if this person gets reelected, which is, we can't rule that out at this point. If this person gets reelected, all the damage would have been done by then, and we would see the results of what this looks like. And, but I mean, it's not just the physical government; it's also the infrastructure. It has to do with our whole financial structure. I mean, if we get into a trade war, I mean, Wall Street is already balking at the trade war. Harley-Davidson announced they're going to move some of their manufacturing further off seas because they can't do it here. So there's going to be a ripple effect on this all the way through. And I think part of the people who have voted for him are going to feel the pinch the worst.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and my daughter lives in the UK, and she just said that there are these incredible conversations going on now around Brexit, which is the same thing.
Yeah, it is.
England's essentially chosen to isolate itself from the rest of the world.
But isn't there a movement afoot now that's trying to reverse that or to vote again? Of
course. You know, it's like here. It's like a 50-50 crapshoot somehow.
Right,
you know, there are almost as many for it as the most of the people that are for it don't have any idea what the implications of it will be. Mm-hmm. In the same way that a lot of people that back Trump don't really understand the implications of what he's doing.
And they may not know that for several years, even long after he's gone, because the effects will ripple down very slowly.
That's right. And they will. They will definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's a very powerful and, you know, a powerful time, and Pluto's a very powerful planet.
Mm-hmm. And then you look at it from an archetypal standpoint, it does signify this sort of dying and rebirthing that is inevitable for all of us. And when we look at our individual charts, I think it does provide a guidepost, or at least a guidance for where we need to put our attention. You know, I'm seeing it going through my fourth house right now. I'm in the process of I'm realizing, without much to my chagrin, I've got to sell my house and move to something smaller. It's that time.
Right. No, I understand that. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting vis-a-vis the public. I mean, it's interesting for me in my time scale that I'm actually coming up to Pluto in the 8th house in my chart. And I don't know whether I'm going to, you know, A, whether I'm going to survive it, but also B, you know, it also is about the public. And I'm, you know, putting myself very much in the public eye in these events that I'm participating in New York in July and August. So, It is, I don't really know for sure what that's going to look like, but that's like a Pluto conjunction in a way.
Right. No, I see that. I think that what it would mean for you more than anything else is that you finally arrive at that spot where you've been long overdue with regard to your status in the world, especially among astrologers. I mean, you've done so much work in this area. It's phenomenal that this is not recognition is not there in the way it should be. I think you're really maybe you're on the brink of great discovery in that regard, or a new level of discovery somehow.
Well, I think so. It's interesting because, I don't know if you know about these articles by Michael Pollan recently,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
About his very new experiences with
hallucinogens,
psychedelic drugs and so on.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just think that it's really fascinating because I've always said that a lot of the main inspirations that affected me when I went from being an architect to being an astrologer in the late 60s, early 70s was very much responsible to that. And I realized that I had certain intuitions about time and about how the solar system moves through time and space and so on that are really quite profound ideas, and that movement of the spiraling solar system through time echoes the DNA molecule. And in the 1970s, DNA had just barely been heard of. So, but the interesting thing was that it's now happening in these recent years, the recent few years. A number of physicists and biologists are actually validating a lot of these totally intuitive ideas I had and wrote about 45 or 50 years ago. So in an interesting way, it is a very Plutonic Jupiter-Pluto time for me, because a lot of what were originally ideas that people scoffed at, and I think they have the potential to totally transform astrology. The whole idea of time being relative and logarithmic instead of linear is another whole idea. But, it's just fascinating that things are changing much more rapidly than people imagine, and that our world is changing. And that I think, again, with that Pluto opposite Mercury in the U.S. chart, what it's really saying is the way to resolve it individually is to upgrade your education.
Upgrade your education. Yeah.
Start thinking openly and thinking freely, to transform your mind. That's exactly what the Dalai Lama talks about.
But how do they do that with the cost of school being what is? It would require a major reorganization, like Bernie Sanders wanted to do.
Well, but I think it starts with a different view of spirituality, and I think it comes from meditation and really a total transformation of what way of thinking is really valuable. For this series of events in New York, I've invited some extraordinary people. One of them is a woman called Skylar Brown, and she's a futurist. And she actually, I've gotten to know her in recent weeks, and she's just an amazing person, for one thing. But she also, she consults with Facebook and Google and Microsoft, basically showing them the way to understand their future is to integrate feminine mysteries.
Right.
To think intuitively like women. And so the last event we're doing, actually, she and I are having a dialogue together, and the title of it is The Future of the Feminine.
Right. And that's been long on our list of things that we saw changing. We saw this happening years ago. We saw the movement of feminism towards, we can see it in all the major movies. It's their first sign of what's to come. We can find always in the arts, it seems like. And we're seeing it in movies and plays. A lot of the major figures in the major popular series are all females, profoundly females. People like in the House of Cards and other films that are very popular, that are political. We see the women's taking step. And I think Hillary sort of breached that first spot to get the ball rolling, and perhaps the next person, I believe, will be a woman. Yes, it may not be in 2020. That's the only thing I'm concerned about.
No, I don't really know, because it would take an incredibly rapid rise for that to happen.
Right, and that person may not be out there yet.
But I do think that women underestimate their potential power, and I think a book project I'm working on now is called The Serpent's Dream, and the subtitle is Symbols of the Divine Feminine and Women's Power. And instead of these kind of funny little hats that they wore at their demonstrations in Washington after Trump was elected, I think more appropriate symbols are serpents and dragons and snakes, real power symbols that show how powerful feminine sexuality and healing is, and how powerful the feminine energy, the guidance of the earth. I think one of the points of this book is that Gaia, which is the Earth, is herself feminine.
Right.
And when you put women in an inferior position, it actually echoes exactly what's happening ecologically now, which is that people are demeaning the Earth, but we live on it.
Right. And that may be the great wake up call. I've always thought
that's also very Plutonic. I
Yeah.
think that the climate is definitely changing, and it's insane to say that there is no climate change or that it's a hoax, which the president does.
Mm-hmm. Especially having Pluto in Capricorn, an Earth-based sign, which is of all the foundational harbinger. The big organizations are being torn down, infrastructure is falling apart, and we don't want. I'm not trying to sound doom and gloom. This is just reality. We can't avoid this. There's not much.
And it's a major transformation that's really happening, and I think we really have to pay attention to it.
Yeah,
it's a very, very powerful dynamic in all kinds of ways.
And there really is no way to stop it. I guess that's what it comes down to. I mean, we can try to stop it. We can try to put that, but it's going to require enormous effort. I'm not sure that the effort to stop it would be worthwhile, though, would it? It is a fait accompli. We have to go through this baptism of fire in order to come out the other end.
Right. Yeah, I'm just looking. I just noticed that Pluto goes into Aquarius in November 2024. Mm-hmm. That's not a very long time away.
Not really. No, it's not that far at all. Yeah,
essentially 5 years away.
Mm-hmm. So we saw this when Pluto first stepped into Capricorn. That was back in 2008, I believe. That's when we first had the financial crisis and the TARP funds that had to bail out Wall Street and all that, and the mortgage scheme and the whole thing. It's just incredible how we've seen this slow march through there, and now we have this character in the White House who is putting the lock on the door and turning the lights off, it seems like.
I know. Well, Pluto is in the second house of the U.S. chart, and transiting Pluto is in the second house also.
Right.
So I think that the artificial rise of the stock market is simply, wealthy people just making more and more money. But I think that also can indicate like the most major crash that's ever happened.
Absolutely. I think it's inevitable. And I think that having a trade war, increasing the tax rate on the lower classes is bound to come back and haunt people. It's a nightmare.
It's got to. And I really do believe that also is very Plutonic, meaning that once you start that kind of thing in motion, that there's going to be hell to pay, especially when you don't screw around with the Chinese, basically, because they're really it's such a powerful country, and it's going to get stronger and stronger.
Mm-hmm. It does make you wonder. I mean, I understand all we're talking about, we're saying, but it does make you wonder why someone would step into power and then alienate all our allies. What is the rationale? It's like going to the playground where your best friends are and just saying "F you" to all of them. What's the point of it?
Well, I don't know, unless he's a Russian agent. I mean, unless they have so much on him in terms of money that he owes them, which is entirely possible, which may be why he doesn't want anyone to look at his financial records.
Oh, I'm sure there's something there. Yeah, that just seems too obvious.
Not only that, but I mean, his kind of habits with women as well. I mean, I just think that a lot of those issues could be something that they're holding over his head, and it's like he's acting like a saboteur in some ways.
Right. But he has gotten away with an awful lot as well, so that does give you wonder.
It's amazing. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it really is. It's startling to see it happen, and the rate of which it's happening is amazing to me as well. The speed with which we see this country being brought down. Just the simple fact that you mentioned people in the EPA and all these other Betsy DeVos, all these people who are in these powerful positions are the exact wrong person to be there. They couldn't be more counter to what we need than they are, and yet they are there. They are. It's almost like it's been deliberate. It's so. But if it wasn't this egregious, if it wasn't this obvious, if it wasn't this blatant, perhaps we wouldn't respond. And so it has to be this blatant in order for us to get angry. I always use the expression that if the roof did not leak, we would not fix it. But the roof is leaking, and we have to fix it. So this is a call to arms in some way. I don't mean machine guns, but I'm just saying a call to action for us to respond. But I'm not sure that the action will help. I think it may be too late for that to happen.
Well, it remains to be seen, because it's something we haven't ever experienced before.
Right, but we can see all the underpinnings there. All the handwork is there. We can just see it. It's all happening. Even the popular films that are out right now, even The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
Sure.
But it's very indicative of where we could go. And, it's incredible. That is if perhaps if we resist. I think you're right about the divine feminine heading in that direction is more logical. That will, I think, solve many, many of our problems. But it's going to take a long time. And that person has not arrived yet, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I just read a lengthy review in The Guardian, which is a UK newspaper.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah.
About The Handmaid's Tale, saying that it's too violent, that it's, it's not really encouraging people to rebel, and so on and so on. Anyway, it's a very controversial film, and it's about Cancer Capricorn.
Exactly. It is exactly about that.
Patriarchy and the feminine, are coming into an opposition. Pluto has already passed the opposition to the sun, but I think that whole idea is just really gaining a lot of steam.
Yeah, it really is incredible how relevant it is to the time where we are now to see this unfolding. Because the arts always reflect where we're going, and this is why I was mentioned earlier. We see these major feminine figures taking top billing. It's a lot of these very influential films, and they are about women in particular. So the time has come that happens. And this guy who's there now is simply the catalyst. Had to be there, but it does give you pause when you see how this to me seems so obvious, as it does to you too, that this is happening, and yet our hands are tied. Perhaps we have let nature take its course here. That's all we can do.
Well, I think that is all we can do, basically, and it's really a very, very powerful dynamic going on, and I think that it will feel the effects of it for a long time.
What do you think about the idea of the eclipse happening on July 11th as at 20 degrees Cancer, directly opposing the position of Pluto now? What does that look like to you, do you think? That looks pretty damn powerful.
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot because it's the first event that I'm doing myself at the group on that night. And I didn't choose the date.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh. Well, that may be your big coming out, where you say you finally, it may be time to hire a PR agent.
Well, I'm already thinking about that. Yeah, I think it's very powerful that, I realize that it's on a full moon and a new moon. And it's funny because all of these events I'm doing are on Wednesday nights. And since the first one's on a full moon, eclipse, that of course every one of them are on quarter or full or new moons.
Yeah, that's
so it's very curious.
That's prophetic.
Well, it was completely accidental that it happened that way. Because I didn't get to choose. I didn't get to choose which days they were. But
maybe it's not accidental.
It's like 6 of 7 Wednesdays, and in the middle of the second half, I'm turning 75, which is also very close to one of the, I think one of the new moons. But it's, it's all fascinating. I think that there is, as you said before, there is a kind of fated dynamic to all these things.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, and so that in that ways, the best way to approach it from a personal as well as a societal level would be to embrace it rather than to fight it. I think that's the secret. I think if you find out where it is in your own personal chart as well, those of you who don't know, I encourage you to contact Tad or someone to get an accurate position of where your Pluto is and where your Pluto transits, where it's happening now. You'll see the action there. You'll just see it.
Absolutely. And, the good thing about having personal readings, as you know, Chris, full well, because you do that too, is that, you have a heads up in these circumstances. You let people know that, that it's not happening tomorrow. It's something that's going to be in process for 3 or 4 or 5 years, given a reasonable orb, especially with Pluto. It moves really slowly.
Right.
So you get a chance to really understand what it is that's being asked of you.
Right. And it's interesting because I've given a lot of thought to this over the last year. I see where my transits are. I see where it's affecting me personally. And I've been resistant in many ways to give into the idea of selling my house and moving to a smaller place. I've just been resistant to it. I've got too many memories here. I built the house myself, and I know that it's just my wife passed away here, and my kids were raised here, so I've got a lot of memories. But perhaps it's time to move on and branch out into a new place. And I've just come recently to the conclusion that this is Pluto in my chart, and I can't fight it. And I need to just give in and make it better.
But it might be a great relief, Chris.
I think it is.
In all kinds of other ways, those kinds of transformations on the other side are really quite dramatic, and it can be something that you really, embrace it rather than resist it. Basically.
That's the big juncture I've just come to over the last several months, is that this is going to happen to me, and jump into it rather than resist it, because resistance is futile. My life, I think, will be much better on the other side. I do believe that. I just got to get through that, and I will, and it'll be fine, and I'll be okay on the other side. But I have used astrology in this case to sort of plan my future in some ways, which is one of the greatest features of astrology, is to be able to do that and see where we're going, and then let it go on. Close that door and see what else opens on the other side.
That's right. That's all we can do. And I think it's better to embrace it than it is to resist it. And, so at the same time, devote all of you out there, devote your energies to moving to the next stage and really figuring out what you need to do right now in the future and what's the best way to approach that kind of situation.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful. And I think that it's not something that we can ignore. And yet, when we think about it, do you think Pluto is valid even though it hadn't been discovered? In other words, looking back in time, do you think its presence in a chart?
It's there. I don't have any doubt that the three outer planets are real, and they've all been discovered since America was.
Right, but I'm saying, do you think that they hold value before they were discovered in the public eye? They still have value archetypally and symbolically.
Yeah, I do. I believe those cycles have probably, if you look more closely, it's since the outer planets were discovered, which is, in the 1700s in the case of Uranus, that, of course, the curious thing about it is that before that time, there weren't countries that were fully formed. And the whole society was profoundly different. Mm-hmm. And I think because these are where we see these planets, to people out there who don't know this, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are really the collective elements of our lives. All of the idea of nationalism is something that happened in the 1700s. Mm-hmm. 1800s, with France, Russia, Germany, England, all of those things changed dramatically. So I think it's coincident with the idea of seeing ourselves as being not just about our individual lives, but about how the collective affects our individual being.
Right.
And those planets definitely have an impact.
Right.
An impact.
So they were there. They were influential. They were symbolic. They were archetypal long before they were discovered. All that happened when they were discovered is they brought them into our consciousness and allowed us to embrace their archetypal symbolism.
Right. It's like Uranus is about electricity and about science, and there was no science basically, or there was no electricity before Edison and people like that.
It's about revolutionary new ideas. We've come through all that.
So it's about a whole change in the society, like the impact that cell phones and computers are having. You walk around. I was walking around San Francisco not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, as I said. And I would walk down certain streets, and literally every person I saw was walking along with a computer up to their face. Mm-hmm. A phone up to their face. Right. And it was amazing. No one was present. It was like a world of zombies.
Yeah. And it's the perfect vehicle to dispel and to disperse false information, this need for this addictive addiction to this device. So we're compelled to pick it up. We're compelled to see what it says, regardless if it's fake or real. And the whole idea of that, like you mentioned, Neptune, cast this veil of disillusionment over all of us. We are all very confused right now. We don't know who to believe.
Yeah, well, this idea of fake news, and no one knows what's real and what isn't. And I say this in a lot of my newsletters, that the bizarre things is that I think a lot of people confuse reality television with reality.
Oh, I know they do, and they do, and it's anything but. It's anything but.
Nothing to do with reality at all.
Yeah, that's the biggest joke of all, the fact that they have that name in there, because it's all just scripted differently. I was the victim of that at one point in my life.
I know you were. I remember. I saw it.
Yeah, it was pretty bizarre. But anyway, so Pluto's presence, I think it's important for each of us to recognize where it is in our individual charts, because, and I encourage people to contact you for that reason, or myself, whatever, to find out where that is, because it would help you to make enormous decisions about which way to go. And it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. It's not death and destruction. It just means that a new order has to be installed.
Yeah, one of the points about it, and I do these updates for people. I have a lot of clients that do a lifetime reading, but then they subsequently want a yearly update. And it turns out that one of the most valuable things, especially creative people can get from that, is that the planets Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto move forward for part of the year, and then they move backwards, and then they move forward again.
Retrograding, right?
When I write books and so on, and I write quite a lot and have written quite a lot, or do creative projects, you want to do creative things when the right outer planets are moving forward, and then when they stop and go backwards, when they go retrograde, is a time to edit.
It's right.
And to analyze and to research and to look back into the past.
Review, research, redo, exactly, recirculate, reconsider.
They're going backwards. They're,
Right.
so it's crazy because a lot of people get in a situation where they're trying to move forward when the planets are moving backwards.
Exactly.
And then by the time they're editing, it's, they're getting left behind because they should be moving forward.
They're out of sync. I always say any word that has RE as a prefix is applicable during any retrograde, regardless of what it is. So.
Sure, of course, absolutely.
Well, reconsider. So before we get off, and we're almost done here. Before we get off, tell us a little more about your experience and what you envision for these talks at the Rubin, because this sounds like a fascinating. The Rubin Museum, for those of you who don't know, is a museum in New York City of Himalayan art, and it is under that veil, under that umbrella, they encompass a lot of Buddhist mentality, philosophy, and a lot of sort of this progressive meditative quality. And for you to be there is really telling. I think it's a real signal that. This is a community and an area of art that's acknowledging astrology in its best form. So this is really exciting.
Well, it is for me too, Chris, for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them is that they're using a lot of my art in the advertising. And that's actually me moving to a whole other level as well. But what I've done is I've invited 5 people. The first event I'm doing on my own on the 11th of July, but I've invited a Peruvian shaman, Maestro Manuel Rufino, who's renowned all over this country, South America, and Europe, as an amazing, we're going to talk about Aztec, Mayan, and indigenous calendar systems and astrologies. And then a woman who is a shaman, a shamaness from Russia. And she's going to come and talk about the rituals of the Siberian shamans, which is incredible. Huh. Then there's going to be an event with a Tibetan Buddhist Lama. His name is Khenpo Siwang Dongyal and Rinpoche, and he's going to be talking about something called terma, which are bits of wisdom that Padmasambhava, who's called the second Buddha, actually hid, in the 7th century A.D., and that they're discovered by certain people called tertons, meaning people who have an advanced spiritual evolution who discover these hidden teachings and bring them into the world at times when there is stress and difficulties.
Wow. Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Mm-hmm. We're also going to talk about Kalachakra Tantra, which is also about a teaching that's related to this time in particular. And then there's an event that Charlotte Benson, who's president of the American Astrology of Vedic Astrology, is going to be doing a talk about Vedic astrology to see how it interfaces with Western and so on.
Right. And there's no one better for that than you, because you sort of have already breached that gap with your time-life astrology.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting. And the last one is with this this great friend of mine, Skylar Brown, who's a futurist and who, really is an advocate for women's rights and an advocate for, taking the feminine forward and introducing these concepts into corporations, into all kinds of things. So it's a very exciting set of programs. And the last one, I think, is the 22nd of August or something like that. There are 3 Wednesdays, and then there's a break around the 1st of August. And then 3 Wednesdays in the middle of August. And so, if you happen to be in New York, go to the Rubin. It's a great place to just hang out also. Oh,
it's a fascinating spot. You get a lot of inspiration there. I got a lot of inspiration there. I had one of my books on sale in the store there for years, but that I have not followed up on that. So I'm very familiar with the Rubin. It's a great spot.
And if you're an artist, as you know, because we both paint mandalas, mm-hmm. that it's really a gold mine of inspiration.
It's a gold mine. You got that right. It's just right up our alley. So I think it's fascinating that you're there. I'm really encouraged by that. Again, that's going to be in the Rubin Museum, which is in New York City, on 6 consecutive Wednesdays in July and August. You go to the rubinmuseum.org. I believe you can find that information there. Exactly. Or it'll also be on your website as well, though, right?
Well, it will, absolutely.
Well, we've run out of time here, and I just want to say before we go, I don't think that we have to. Life is full of strife and change, and I think that if we acknowledge that, and as you say, take Pluto into our arms and make it him our friend and follow his advice, we will come out okay at the other end rather than trying to resist it. And I think this is a great lesson to be learned. I've come upon this epiphany myself, and I think it's just a way that we move forward, and who knows what the future will hold as a result. So. Very good. Anyway, my guest today has been Tad Mann. His website is atmann, atmann.net. He's an astrologer, an author, an artist, an architect, and in my opinion, one of the world's greatest astrologers. Really a man way ahead of his time, I believe, and a great inspiration to me. So it's been great to have you on today, Tad. Thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing about your talks, and I encourage people to look you up. So there we go. All right.
Thank you, Chris.
Very good. Take care.
Yep.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.